It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, former chairman of the Conservative Party and Jeremy Hunt supporter Patrick McLaughlin. Andrea Leadsom, who recently resigned as leader of the House of Commons, she's backing Boris Johnson. The Guardian's North of England editor Helen Pidd and the Press Association's Jennifer McKiernan. The two Conservative leadership contenders have clashed over the Brexit deadline. Will it be Halloween or just after?
Well, I think that 31st of October, come hell or high water deadline is a fake deadline.
So we understand...
And getting ready to come out on October the
31st.
31st, correct.
Come what may.
Come what may.
Do or die?
Come what may. Do or die. Come what may.
Meanwhile, these two are disagreeing about Labour's Brexit position, with John McDonnell saying their policy needs to change to avoid a slow-motion car crash. And could beavers solve all our flooding problems? We visit a trial in Devon where they've been reintroduced after 400 years.
If you live in a floodplain, particularly, having beavers in that river system upstream of you could be really important.
Let's start with this because Boris Johnson, in the midst of the leadership contest, revealed that he likes to make model buses and then paint them in his spare time. Patrick, what do you do in your spare time?
I potter about in my garden and my greenhouse. That's what I do in my spare time. It's very useful, actually.
And cathartic.
And cathartic, yes, absolutely.
Andrea Leadsom?
Cooking, going to the gym.
By the way, do you believe Boris Johnson actually makes these model buses and paints them?
Yeah, why not?
Have you seen one?
I haven't, no.
Would you like to?
Not bothered.
No.
Some very good auction prizes.
Yes, well, something to think about, isn't it, for the Conservative Party?
Yeah.
Helen,
Nice raffle
what do you
prize.
do in your spare time?
I like riding my bike in the Peak District near where I live in Stockport.
Very energetic. Jennifer?
I play roller derby, which is like roller skating and rugby sort of crossover. It's quite good.
Oh, fascinating. I'm so glad I asked everybody. Let's start with the interview done by the BBC's political editor Laura Kuenssberg with Jeremy Hunt. She interviewed Boris Johnson and yesterday interviewed the Foreign Secretary. Let's hear an excerpt from it.
Both Boris and I want to change that deal, and the judgment is who is the person we trust as Prime Minister to go to Brussels and bring back that deal. It's about the personality of our Prime Minister. If you choose someone where there's no trust, there's going to be no negotiation, no deal, and quite possibly a general election, which could mean we have no Brexit either. If you choose someone that the other side will talk to, who's going to be very tough, but there will at least be a negotiation, and I believe there's a deal to be done.
Patrick, Jeremy Hunt says it's all about the personality of whoever becomes Prime Minister and it's about character and trust. But what does he offer in that department that's going to magically unlock the
Well, I
impasse?
think he offers the fact that he's done things outside politics. So he built a business up which employed 200 people. He's been a negotiator for the health service. He managed to secure, by the time he finished as health secretary, an extra £21 billion for the health service. So we've seen him time and time again negotiating in the departments that he's run. Culture, media and sport in 2010, the run-up to the Olympics. Lots of work to do, lots of negotiations to take place. A great success. We never hear about it because it was successful. And likewise as his time as Health Secretary too. So I think he's a man that confronted with problems, addresses them, negotiates them, and then comes up with solutions.
But what is the magic ingredient in his personality that is going to be able to change what the EU has stated repeatedly, which is they're not reopening the withdrawal agreement and that they stand by everything that they've committed to with Theresa May?
Well, I think what they get is a new Prime Minister who will look at it in a different way, and that's going to be the case with whoever enters number 10 in July.
Exactly.
But Jeremy has much more of a track record of actually in those negotiations. And over the last 12 months as Foreign Secretary, I think he's got a reputation in Europe, which is something that I'm very proud of.
Right, but so far they haven't indicated that they would be prepared to move on any of those key issues, including the Irish backstop. So we are going to take it on trust in the same way that he is saying you shouldn't trust Boris Johnson.
Well, it's not a matter of trust. It's a matter of sort of getting on with the job and actually saying that the British people voted for us to leave the European Union. That we've got to do. I was a Remainer, but I accept the results of the referendum, and that's the way we've got to move forward.
Right, and you, as you say, you were a Remainer. But what's wrong with Jeremy Hunt, your candidate, that he can't even persuade other Remainers who have joined Boris Johnson? People complain that Boris Johnson is playing to the sort of hard Brexiteer wing, but he's managed to convince Oliver Dowden, Lucy Fraser, Matt Hancock and others. Jeremy Hunt can't.
Jeremy Hunt has managed to get two of the hardest Brexiteers who were sitting around the cabinet table, who have been watching him for the last few years since they've been in the cabinet, Penny Mordaunt and Liam Fox, who are both supporting him, saying that this is the person who is the best person to negotiate. Now, they've got the advantage of having seen him as Foreign Secretary around the cabinet table and the way he's approached issues. I haven't got that because I left the cabinet before he became Foreign Secretary.
Who was a better Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt or Boris Johnson?
I think Jeremy has been an incredibly good Foreign Secretary.
What was wrong with Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary?
I think there were times when Boris wasn't quite on top of the brief.
Danny Finkelstein has argued, and let's show everybody the Times, argued in the paper that Jeremy Hunt must have a go at creating Jeremy mania. Not very catchy, but saying the Foreign Secretary's challenge isn't holding Boris Johnson to account, but enthusing party members with a positive vision. Is he right?
There's something in that. Jeremy's got a lot more to come over with. I watched the hustings from Birmingham. I thought the way in which Jeremy answered the questions was incredibly thoughtful and very detailed on all the questions. Never once did he have to sort of pause.
But what about Jeremy mania, a buzz, a vibe?
I think that will that will come. I think the point that you've got to take on board of this is the party membership is not quite the membership that just look at Conservative Home and to take everything that's in Conservative Home. It's a lot broader than that, and Jeremy's going to do a lot over the next few weeks of getting out into the country and meeting a lot of people. We've seen that. We've seen him go off from the starting blocks incredibly fast.
Right.
We'll continue to see it.
He said he'll work with Boris Johnson and he hopes Boris Johnson will work with him, depending on who wins this contest. So was it a mistake for Jeremy Hunt to call Boris Johnson a coward? Because these two men will inevitably end up working together.
I think in the heat of elections you always get that. I often look at the way in which the American system runs, and candidates call all sorts of things, but once the decision is taken, they work together and they work for the country.
Right, so it wasn't wrong for him to call him that. It doesn't poison the atmosphere?
I don't think it poisons the atmosphere. You've just got to get on, and that these things happen during the early stages of any election campaign.
What do you make of Jeremy Hunt's campaign so far?
I don't know. I mean, I think there's a bit too much of an overemphasis on personality. I used to be the Guardian's Germany correspondent, and I found it quite reassuring that Angela Merkel was pretty dull. As a sort of for somebody living in Germany at that point, you felt like she knew what she was doing. But, you know, the force of Boris's personality is next level, and you do have to find something to counter that.
Jennifer?
Well, I think Jeremy Hunt has so far given a solid, just not very scintillating performance. He does need that Jeremy mania. We've seen an attempt at that last night with the Bojo No-Show Twitter hashtag, but it was kind of unconvincing if it was actually Jeremy Hunt behind that. I'm not sure if it was. But certainly he addressed that issue that he is just Theresa May in trousers, saying that he didn't really fancy those
leather trousers. Do you want to see a bit more of that coming through?
I think he needs it. If you're going to go up against Boris Johnson, I think you really need to be putting on a bit more showmanship to win over the crowd. Because Jeremy Hunt has this thing where he's very engaging, he's perfectly pleasant, as he described Ironbrew as well. He's perfectly pleasant, but he just doesn't seem to have that wow factor when he's meeting people.
Patrick?
Well, I think when people do meet him and when he's got the level of exposure that he's obviously going to get during this campaign, and that's why I was very sorry that Boris decided not to take part in the Sky Television debate last night, because I think both of the candidates have got to be put under not just party scrutiny but public scrutiny as well. And sometimes, Joe, facing sort of inquisitors like yourself on us, you know, we perhaps reveal a bit more than we should do, and that's in itself can be quite revealing for the person who's going to, in the end, have this highest job.
Well, I always hope so, of course. Bojo No-Show.
Well, you know, I think the conversation so far just highlights why Boris is the right person.
Or didn't turn up for that
Well,
debate.
No, he doesn't have to turn up for every single thing that's on offer. I mean, you know, he's taken a huge amount of direct interviews from very good interviewers like Laura Kuenssberg and Nick Ferrari. You know, he's actually getting proper one-to-one scrutiny, but not
head-to-head.
No, but the point I want to make is that this whole conversation demonstrates why it needs to be Boris, because as people are saying, you know, it's about the character. Now, back in 2016, I did those Wembley debates with Boris and spent days with him, and I can tell you, he is a passionate Brexiteer. He believes in the future that awaits the United Kingdom once we leave the European Union. Jeremy campaigned to remain. Through Cabinet in the last 3 years, I've seen him time and again concerned about leaving without a deal. Very reluctant, as he said himself, the 31st of October is a fake deadline. I mean, I have a lot of time for Jeremy, but he is not the person we need right now. Boris will reach out right across the country. This mustn't be just about what Conservative members want. It's about what the people of the United Kingdom want, and 17.4 million of them want us to have already left the European Union. We have to get on with it.
Well,
with Boris, we will.
Let's hear what Jeremy Hunt had to say on the deadline.
Well, I think that 31st of October, come hell or high water deadline is a fake deadline because it's more likely to trip us into a general election before we've delivered Brexit, and that would hand the keys of number 10 to Jeremy Corbyn, and then we'd have no Brexit at all. But in my case, how would I approach this? I think we'll know very soon, well before the 31st of October, if there is a deal to be done along the basis I've said. And if there isn't, and if no deal is still on the table, I've been very clear. I will leave the European Union without a deal.
Even if the 31st of October is a fake deadline, as far as you're concerned and Jeremy Hunt is concerned, the point is it's a commitment that means that Boris Johnson will win over the grassroots, and they are the people who matter, who are voting in this contest, and Jeremy Hunt will lose.
The thing you've got to ask, and I think I'd say to Andrea, because Andrea has been passionate in her desire to leave the European Union and has done everything she can as leader of the House of Commons. Now, the simple fact is, nothing in the House of Commons has changed. And we are still going to be in the position where we are facing an opposition to leaving without no deal, and that becomes impossible. So, Andrea, if there is no deal, does that mean we've got a general election immediately after the 31st of October in December?
No, I mean, you know, I'm glad you give me the chance to respond to that, because having been leader of the House of Commons for 2 years, I can absolutely tell you we could have left the European Union at the end of March. The reason we didn't is because of the Letwin, Cooper, whoever's bill it was, that in effect the government was complicit in putting in government amendments in the House of Lords to make sure that, in fact, the Prime Minister could agree to an extension.
A government you were part of.
That's why we are where we are. And these things, you know, to me, leaving the EU is the reason I stayed in government for 3 years, to support the Prime Minister, Theresa May, as Prime Minister, to get the Brexit that I firmly believe in. And for me, it's not about, oh, we've just got to get on with this because the people told us to. For me, it's that this is going to be fantastic for the United Kingdom. And I think Boris believes that too.
But if Parliament doesn't pass and agree the legislation, how do you do it?
The legal default.
How do you do it? There's about 5 bills in the backup at the moment.
No, that's just not true, Patrick.
That needs to be taken forward. So the immigration bill isn't needed. The agricultural bill,
correct. Not needed.
Correct. So all those bills that we were told were essential, we were being misled.
No, they are absolutely essential. So specifically how it works is most of the preparations for no deal were done through secondary legislation. That's all been done. That was done by March the 29th under my office. The bills that you talk about, agriculture, immigration and so on, those are all future policy. Those all deal with after leaving the European Union. Now, they do have deadlines that they need to get royal assent by, but none of them need royal assent by the 31st of October. The legal default is we leave at the end of October. There is no means for Parliament, other than bringing down the government, as Oliver Letwin has gone on here to say, another procedural geek like myself. You cannot prevent the government from deciding to go along with the legal default position, which is that we leave at the end of October.
When the new Prime Minister assumes office, there will be approximately 24 sitting days between then and actually the 31st of October. Are you saying that, given what the makeup of Parliament is at the moment, that can get through the House of Commons without the government losing a confidence motion?
Nothing
and
needs to go through the House of Commons.
A December election.
Nothing needs to go through the House of Commons.
So you're saying the House of Commons, take back control. The House of Commons has no say over the deal or no deal.
The House of Commons has had a say in the EU Withdrawal Act. The House of Commons voted to trigger Article 50. The House of Commons approved and got royal assent for the EU Withdrawal Act. The House of Commons then declined the meaningful vote vote on the withdrawal agreement bill three times. Therefore, it was the reason I resigned was because I did not agree that we should bring in a withdrawal agreement bill that contained the potential for a second referendum. That's why I resigned. There is no legislation required. The House of Commons has approved.
Except you said, what
of Article
about
50?
a motion of no confidence that is brought against the government?
That is the only way in which the House of Commons could actually
And you've got people that are saying that they
Brexit.
would vote for that.
And that is a possibility, but the reality is there is a huge number of people in Parliament who want to abide by the will of 17.4 million people. I do not think that the House of Commons would want to
not thinking is not a
Article
guarantee.
50.
And could I ask you both a question on behalf of those of us in the country, the majority of us who are not members of the Conservative Party? How is this leadership election being allowed to take so long when we know that the clock is ticking? Something's got to happen by the 31st of October, and yet we've got 4 more weeks of this. Are people really going to be changing their mind between now and then who they want, Jeremy Hunt or Boris Johnson? I just don't see it. Why is it taking so long?
Well, I think it's taking so long because we are going out to party member vote, and you're right, it is the first time this has ever happened. So it didn't happen when Theresa May became Prime Minister. It didn't happen when Gordon Brown, if you can think back that far, to when Gordon Brown slaughtered all the opposition around him and ensured that there was no party ballot of his membership. So we are in unique circumstances. Those are the rules of electing a leader, actually for both of the main parties. The fact that this is the first time it's being used when you've been in government and it's affected the Prime Minister is just how we are.
How does the contest look to you, Jennifer, and the people that you speak to?
At the moment, it seems Boris can do no wrong, basically. We saw the polls plummeting after that row with his partner, but he's still maintaining a lead. Jeremy Hunt doesn't seem to be doing much to actually to attack him. So we're stuck in this limbo where it probably is going to be 3 more weeks of the same old, and Boris emerging as the winner.
Leaving on October the 31st, Andrea, come what may, do or die. He's made himself a prisoner, hasn't he, Boris Johnson, of that promise. His personal reputation is tied indelibly to that promise on October the 31st. What will happen to public trust if he doesn't deliver it?
So this is real life. This isn't a theoretical life. The legal default position is we leave at the 31st of October, come what may. That is the legal position.
But you've said yourself there is a possibility of a confidence motion.
What Boris is saying is he is absolutely committed to delivering on the legal default position. Now, nobody has a crystal ball, so things can get in the way, but what he is absolutely determined to do and passionately believes in is leaving the European Union at the end of October. And what's a really important point here is, in order to get any form of renegotiation with the EU that enables us to leave smoothly at the end of October, you have to be prepared to walk away.
So it's a negotiating. So it's a negotiating tactic.
No, he is absolutely clear.
If there is the possibility of a deal by the 31st of December,
no,
Prime
October.
Minister Johnson is saying no.
No. Johnson is saying we will leave at the end of October. It will not be necessary. Any negotiation that the EU chooses to undertake, they can do by the 31st of October. Let's not
Andrea,
forget.
but you know, in any deal, it could be a few days, it could be a few days, it could be a few weeks away. The Commission will only have just been put in place. In the EU, you need a bit longer, and it's mid-November. You're not doing it.
No, because the EU, let's be clear, when Greece was about to bust out of the euro, within 3 days, the EU, at 28 EU member states, agreed European Banking Union. That didn't even have a basis in the statutes. The point is, this is a negotiation where, unless you have the very real threat that your other counterpart is going to walk away, but you will not negotiate. So Boris is absolutely rightly determined.
But you've just said and underlined, it is a huge gamble.
It's not.
And it's a huge gamble that will immediately define him. A gamble that the EU will budge when they say they won't.
It is not
a gamble that
gamble,
Parliament
it's a
won't stop him if he heads towards no deal, which they've said they will, and a gamble that he takes us out without a deal, that the economy won't be hit hard. They're gambles, but they are gambles.
No, they're not. They're negotiations. You're choosing the word gamble. Boris is quite clear. We will leave at the end of October, come what may. That is the legal default position, and Parliament does not have the means to overturn that.
And he'll win this contest with that, Patrick.
Well, we'll see. There's a long way to go in the contest, and I think that what we need is a negotiated settlement. We're talking about We're not talking about leaving some Emily zone or something like that. We're talking about Europe. We're talking about people who we work closely with.
We're not leaving Europe.
We're leaving the European
leaving
Union.
the institutions.
We're leaving the
EU.
institutions, but we will still want good relationships, and I think that's
so
very
will they.
important.
And so will they,
Hang on.
and that's the key point here.
Right, but it is a deadline. It's a firm deadline. Do or die. That is what Conservative
I'm not
voters
sure.
here want to
I
hear,
am not
and the EU will
Yes.
sit up and listen.
Exactly.
What we've got to make sure is that whatever the Prime Minister of the day does not affect or ruin jobs or opportunities for this country. And that is very important. And we're in negotiations, and that's why those negotiations should take place. And we would know very soon after the new Prime Minister is elected towards the end of July exactly how those negotiations are going on and whether it's going to be possible to get some changes to the backstop, which I think is probably one of the biggest issues that is holding up the whole of progress on this.
Right, one final question. Proroguing Parliament. Would Boris Johnson resort to that?
No, nobody would prorogue Parliament. I mean, nobody would involve the Queen. I don't believe that Boris would do such a thing.
Has he ruled it out with you?
I'm not. I do not believe any serious Prime Minister would consider proroguing Parliament. I haven't discussed it specifically with him because my expectation is that he would absolutely rule it out. But the reality is that, in fact, there would be very severe constitutional problems with, in effect, just preventing Parliament from being sitting whilst such.
And then just finally, Patrick, before we let you go, would Jeremy Hunt ever countenance a second referendum?
No.
Well, that was short and sweet. Jennifer and Patrick, thank you very much for joining us. We're moving on because in a week where we've had flash flooding, it sounds unlikely, but could beavers be the answer? Have a look at this.
They're like a big Labrador, really, with short legs and a big flat tail. Beavers are amazing animals. They are real engineers. They are having a dramatic impact on the environment, and that benefits a whole range of other species. So we've got a dam here, we've got a dam here. All this has been created by the beavers, and all the trees have been cut down by the beavers. If you live in a floodplain, particularly, having beavers in that river system upstream of you could be really important. Because what beavers do, by creating these wetlands, they're slowing the flow of water that's coming off the hills upstream of where you live. And if we can slow water down and hold it upstream, then potentially you don't get these big flood peaks that come down and can flood communities that live in those low-lying areas. This is one of the most significant dams that we've got in the lower part of the River Otter catchment.
They are very mischievous and cheeky creatures. Where beavers go into land that's pasture, where we can allow it to be wet, that's okay, that can be acceptable. But what we're seeing at the moment are the beavers going into grade 1 and grade 2 arable land that grows potatoes, that grows maize and corn, and we're beginning to see drainage, land drains blocking, and that's having an impact on the ability for the farmer to produce those high value crops. I think we could probably come up with a structure that could work for both the environment and farmers. If a farmer is going to lose land to rewilding through the beavers and through water attenuation, I think it's important to understand the economic impact on that farming business. The jury's probably out slightly for us at the moment, but I think on the wider picture, it's got to be a good thing to have them introduced back into the UK.
We've been joined in the studio by Danielle Rowley, who is Labour's shadow spokesperson on climate justice and green jobs, and by Rupert Read from Extinction Rebellion. Welcome to both of you. Rupert, Michael Gove supports the reintroduction of beavers as a way of boosting biodiversity, while beavers were reintroduced in Scotland in 2009. Is that the answer to introduce them across England?
Absolutely, surely. This is one part of rewilding, which is one absolutely vital part of what we need to do to restore the horrendously nature-depleted nature of our country. And also it can help in flood protection, as the film showed, and help in potentially sequestering carbon. Part of what we need to do if we're going to be serious about achieving net zero carbon is to find natural ways of drawing carbon down, enriching our soil and so forth.
But they are destructive, Danielle, and there are complaints from farmers. Should they be compensated?
Well, we're consulting at the moment with lots of different groups, different bodies, to find out what the effect would be and what the impact would be.
Right, and what's your personal position?
Well, my personal position, I'm learning a lot about beavers at the moment, but I think it's something that, we need to consult on. We need to have that expert opinion and advice on. It's not something that that I can make my mind up on.
Doesn't sound like Labour's convinced at the moment.
Well, I think there's a long way to go before the old political parties fully wake up to the fact that rewilding is bound to be a big part of the answer to the problems that we're facing in terms of nature, in terms of climate. And rewilding means taking some land that human beings have been dealing with and managing artificially and returning it to nature. That is what it means. So it's bound to mean that some land goes back to the animals, back to nature.
Do you accept that?
Yeah, I think that something I'm really concerned about is making sure that our natural environment is protected. And recently I visited a local river which had been absolutely polluted with, sanitary tiles, with wet wipes that people have been flushing. And the destruction that has on our wildlife is really worrying as well.
Right. Well, let's talk about, because today I think the law to enshrine the target of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 is in the Lords. Anyway, it's going to be enshrined fully. Is that ambitious enough?
Absolutely not. Of course, in Extinction Rebellion, we're saying the target ought to be 2025. And 2050 is death, basically. 2050 is genocide. 2050 means the collapse of our civilization. So it's wonderful that the government is moved in the right direction compared to where it was, and that's been achieved through the kind of pressure, the non-violent direct action of Extinction Rebellion. But we have far further to go if we're actually serious about bequeathing a future to our children.
Andrea?
Well, first of all, I completely agree with Rupert that we have to move to net carbon zero as soon as we humanly can.
But you've got 2050.
Yeah, I mean, the government's position is 2050, but the reality is that once you go in a certain direction, you move much faster than you ever thought possible. So, for example, the UK, back in the sort of Climate Change Act days, 2008, I think it was then thought you'd have to take a big hit to your country's GDP in order to decarbonise. But yet what we've seen is we're decarbonising faster than any G7 country, 23% reduction in emissions, and we're at the same time seeing GDP growing. So I think as we change the incentives, as we improve incentives for using more renewables, for moving to electric vehicles and so on, that we'll see that shift to net zero much sooner than predicted.
A bit unfortunate then, Andrea, that you opposed the increase of renewables in this country. You stopped onshore wind and you cut feed-in tariffs for renewables.
That's absolutely not the case. No, I didn't stop anything. What I did was to look at the budget, because people on their energy bills, people who can't afford to heat themselves,
this is an emergency.
Hear me out.
Right?
Hear me out. It is an emergency for someone who can't afford to heat themselves in the middle of winter, who gets pneumonia as a result.
Right.
That is an emergency for them.
It's a rather bigger emergency if we collapsed our civilization.
The point is that what we did was to say that onshore wind was in a financial position to be able to survive with new projects that didn't need a subsidy from the energy bill payer. So that was not stopping anything at all. And let's be clear, the UK accounts for half the world's offshore deployed wind. We have presided over a massive
but it depends on how much sacrifice
cost.
people are prepared to make and whether government will legislate for it.
I don't see how the government with a straight face can make these promises about carbon while supporting a third runway at Heathrow. We know that carbon emissions are overwhelmingly from air travel and also from car travel, which successive governments have made cheaper, while public transport, bus and train tickets have gone up. And what the government should be doing really is promoting low carbon and no carbon transport.
Right, what about Labour? John McDonnell sort of flirted with the idea of bringing forward the target. I spoke to him on Monday, but when I asked him, is he going to bring it forward to 2030 in terms of achieving that neutral carbon emissions, he said they're looking at it. I mean, it cannot all be about looking at consultations, inquiries. Have you got a firm policy?
I think people are actually fed up with politicians coming in and saying, we know best and this is what they're doing, and not listening. Why would we not listen to scientists, to experts, to fantastic campaign groups that are telling us what we need to do? But what we need to do is make sure that we're reducing the risk, that we're stopping a climate catastrophe, and we're also making sure that jobs are safeguarded, that people's lives are safeguarded.
So you're not prepared to make the sacrifice that would be necessary in the eyes of Rupert in terms of achieving the goal of reducing the risks of climate change. When it comes to Heathrow expansion, did you vote in favour of a third runway? Many of your colleagues did.
I voted against it.
What did you say about the Labour Party who mostly...
against it.
Right.
But we're guided by the science, we're guided by the experts. And Andrea said earlier that once you set a target, then everything else will follow. Well, not really, because the government have set a target that they're already on course to miss. And without taking any action, there's a lot of action the government could take right now that would help them on their way, but they won't do, such as effectively stopping the blocking of onshore wind.
Your party, so I live in Greater Manchester, and where Andy Burnham is the mayor, of course, and he set out a policy a few weeks ago to be the greenest city region in Europe, while at the same time supporting expansion at Manchester Airport. The local councils in Greater Manchester own the airport, and the airport wants to double air transport. I just don't see how the Labour Party can have it both ways, and the same goes for the Tories, actually.
I'm all about looking at how we can create jobs, but green jobs. That's really important to me. And being a Scottish MP as well, and I think the only person here that's Scottish, there's so much potential in Scotland. So I'm going to be looking at how we can support the economy, but a green economy.
Right. John McDonnell also confirmed his plan to delist companies from the London Stock Exchange who failed to meet environmental criteria if a Labour government came into power. How would that work?
Well, the point of that is that it's not about tinkering around the edges, and it's not about, maybe a slap on the wrist. It's about proper action. And we need to have a sustainable economy as well as a thriving economy.
Right. Would you be in favour of that?
Look, sooner or later, we're going to have firm, hard environmental limits, resource limits, pollution limits, etc. The endless obsession with economic growth, which both the speakers from the political parties here are putting forward,
well, it is important,
what's driving us towards extinction. No, it's not important. What's important is survival. The climate school strikers are begging for their lives, and that's why we in Extinction Rebellion do what we do. Would join us.
That's extraordinary. You should really be ashamed of yourself, saying the economy is not important. That is the most ridiculous thing I've heard in this very long while. It's the economy that pays for our NHS, it pays for our infrastructure, it pays for the schools, the education for those young people who you're getting to walk out of schools.
Andrea called
the greatest
for striking
they were
and standing up for their
and
lives.
The reason I said that is because an education is the greatest gift that society gives to its children. And what you're saying is that an economy that pays for those things is not important. That is ridiculous, utterly ridiculous.
The endless pursuit of economic growth is driving us towards...
It's not the endless pursuit,
driving us towards
Rupert.
civilisational collapse. And if you carry on doing that, you will be judged.
No, I have just made the very clear point that it was thought you would have to take a hit to your economy in order to decarbonise. That has now been delinked. In my view, and I think Danielle was saying the same, you can actually create a new green, a sort of virtuous cycle whereby you have new green jobs that actually enable people to get new skills, new jobs, new growth, new opportunities at the same time as decarbonising. That's where our focus is. It's where your focus should be.
It's an emergency. Get real. We're going to have to make some hard choices. Wake up.
Rupert, thank you very much for coming in. We're going to talk about the Labour Party and Labour's position on Brexit. You and your colleagues met in the Shadow Cabinet yesterday. The Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, warned that the party needs to change its policy on Brexit to avoid a slow-motion car crash. Is he wrong?
I've had, a recent promotion, but I'm not quite in the shadow cabinet, so I wasn't in that meeting. So I don't know what was discussed in that meeting.
Well, we know, because the John McDonnell was reported widely as saying so, that the party needs to change its policy on Brexit to avoid a slow-motion car crash. Is he wrong?
I think that we're a democratic party, so we're out consulting with our members, making sure that we are, we're not making decisions from the top. We're a grassroots movement, so we're looking at what our members want, and we are evolving and we are changing.
But Danielle, it's been 3 years, untold number of meetings, and still confusion. I mean, there is policy evolution, and then there is policy paralysis. Which is it here?
It's evolution. Jeremy Corbyn said straight after the European election, we have to review our policy and, we have to recognise what happened. And that's what's been happening. We've been whipped 3 times to support a confirmatory vote.
All right,
and that's an evolution of our policy, clearly.
But more or less everybody in the shadow cabinet, as you know, is freelancing on this issue. They're saying what they really think. You can talk to Emily Thornberry or now even John McDonnell. What would you personally like to see happen?
I'm quite proud of our shadow cabinet because it represents the country, and the country has differing opinions. We're not a bunch of zombies,
No, well, you're not a zombie, so what do you think?
I think I absolutely support a confirmatory vote on any deal, on any outcome.
That's what the policy is. Should they campaign for Remain?
Well, I'll be campaigning for Remain. I've always been a Remainer. I will be campaigning for that. But it's about making sure we bring the country with us. And when I'm speaking to my constituents, they want to know, how their well-being is being protected, and they're not as caught up on, politicians and parties coming down firmly on one side or the other. They want to know how their lives will be affected.
Well, I mean, if you look at the European elections and the results there for Labour, I think people did want to know which side of the fence you're on. I mean, we've had the Shadow Chancellor, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, the Deputy UK Leader, the Scottish Labour Leader, the Welsh Labour Leader, the majority of union members, the majority of party members. All of them want Labour to endorse Remain on that ballot paper. Why are they being ignored?
They're not being ignored. The opposite of that. We're consulting with them right now, and that's why.
But they've made it clear. There's no you don't need a consultation. It's very clear what they believe.
Well, we're not going to be guided by headlines. We're going to be guided by the consultation we're doing with our members right now.
So you are ignoring all those people, in the shadow cabinet and leaders. Yeah, but they've said what they want, and they want Labour to campaign for Remain.
We're talking to them right now. We're having this consultation. We're listening exactly as you say, and that's how we form our policy. We're a democratic party.
I have some sympathy with the Labour Party. They are in a terrible bind over this. But if you look at the people in the shadow cabinet who are supporting a second referendum, they are largely London MPs. So Emily Thornberry, the Brexit Secretary, Keir Starmer, London MPs. And I think if they represented more working class seats in the Midlands, in the north of England, they would have a different opinion on this. And a couple of weeks ago, I was in Redcar in Teesside and I met a former steelworker there who was also a Labour councillor. And in the European elections, he voted for the Brexit Party. And that, how are you going to square that circle? That is a really tricky thing to deal with.
I think that really gets to the nub of the problem. And in my constituency in Scotland, out on the doors during the recent EU election, I had people saying that they were thinking of supporting the Brexit Party. So we need to understand why that's happening, and by jumping to one policy or another,
that's not
taking
people want to leave the European Union. How many times do they have to scream it at us? Even those who wanted to remain in the EU say to me constantly, "We've just got to leave." There's no reverse throttle. A second referendum, what does that do to the 17.4 million people who voted to leave? Why should they have to confirm that they voted to leave? And it would take 2 years to get that done, to get the legislation through. It would be the biggest bust-up ever. It would probably in itself lead to a general election just to legislate for it. Then you'd have another referendum. Businesses and people need certainty in all circumstances.
People feel let down by us, by politicians.
They do.
And that's what they say, because we've not managed to get Brexit done already.
Yeah.
But so much has changed since then that we need to check that this is what people want.
You don't have time.
And there wasn't during the referendum, there wasn't a clear, well, this is what the deal will be, this is how your lives will be post-Brexit. We have to check it's what people want, and we have to be honest with
a second referendum
about the implications.
No, that's simply not true. Before the referendum, do you remember the government pamphlet that went out saying there'd be 500,000 job losses, pensions would be cut, the NHS would be cut. You know, there were so many. Project Fear, that's where it came from, was all of the horrors that would happen. And yet people still voted to leave the EU. We have to do as they say. It wasn't a sort of advisory kind of, you know, let's see what you think and then we'll come back and ask you again later.
People didn't know what the deal would be.
Is it about leadership? Because Emily Thornberry has said this is exactly about leadership. Is it time for a new leader who is capable of taking a decision in a crisis?
No, it's about strong leadership by taking people with us and by speaking to people around the country, particularly in areas like mine, post-industrial areas where people have lost jobs, they've lost industry, they've went through years of austerity, they're seeing their services being decimated and they're angry about that.
But
we need to be in those communities and that's where we are.
Is there a rift, though, between John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn now? You have Ian Lavery, the party chairman, and you have Len McCluskey, who is the General Secretary of the Unite Union, both very, very close allies of Jeremy Corbyn, who want the UK to leave the EU, and all those other people that I have listed who want Labour to campaign for Remain. How do you ever square that circle?
What all of those people you mentioned want is protection for workers.
No, they want two different... Yeah, they do, but
jobs.
they want two different ways of achieving it. So how do you square it? One set want to leave, one set want to remain. Two of them are very close to Jeremy Corbyn, and the rest are in the shadow cabinet and leaders throughout the UK.
We square that circle by consulting our members, by being led by the huge movement across the UK that is our party and is our grassroots movement, and we're guided by that.
But Danielle, you're not making a decision. There's so little time left and you still haven't made a decision 3 years on.
When's it going to be made?
I mean, I don't think that Andrea's in a position to talk about decisions.
Well, I've already said I am so sorry.
That is
I am so sorry that we haven't left the EU
well,
yet.
And on
I've absolutely been determined and focused on
that basis, because we haven't spoken to you since
Yeah.
you were knocked out of the contest. How are you feeling?
I'm fine, thanks, Jo.
Good.
Yeah.
In a polite way. Disappointed,
well.
feeling...
Yeah, very, very disappointed, obviously, but it's always fantastic to get your life back. You know, I'm having dinners with friends.
Why do you think you didn't get more support?
You'd have to ask my colleagues, genuinely. I mean, you know, I can speculate. There are all sorts of reasons people gave. You know, I mean, I do genuinely think a lot of people just feel Boris is the right person to get us out of the European Union. He's a passionate Brexiteer. They feel he should have done it last time, and they were determined to support him.
You were, or rather the paper, reported that you were told by another female MP that she'd been told there were too many, or they'd had too many female prime ministers and therefore didn't need another one.
Too many, too.
Well, all I would say about that is if you had a terrible male Prime Minister, I'm sure people wouldn't be going around saying, oh, we can't have another man, let's have a dog next time.
Well, did that surprise you?
No, I wasn't
is it true?
surprised. It is true. And I wasn't surprised.
You weren't surprised. What do you say to that, Helen?
I don't know, I can only really laugh at that. The thing I don't understand is why does anybody want this job? Andrea, why did you want it?
That's a really good question.
Such a poison chalice.
Exactly. So many people say to me, why on earth? And not once, but twice. And the reality is to deliver on Brexit, to really do something for the country. You know, it's a passion I have, is to do something for the country. So, yeah.
Welcoming Laura Kuenssberg into the studio. Laura, just before I come to you, there were so many candidates, and most of them men.
Yes.
You and Esther McVey, and there was an expectation we were going to see Amber Rudd, Penny Mordaunt, Liz Truss. Were you surprised not more women put themselves forward?
I mean, you know, it's as we've
Helen
just
said,
agreed.
yeah.
Helen said, it's why would anyone want that job? So, no, I'm not surprised when people don't put their names forward, and I just commend everybody who did. I mean, it's a huge amount of work, and when you get knocked out early, it's depressing. But anyway, you move on quickly.
You didn't weep in the corner?
I did not. I never weep, Jo, OK?
It's not a sign of weakness crying. Come on, real women
but I never do
cry.
it. That's it.
Well, Jeremy...
You will never hear me admit to crying ever again. Did it once and it dogged me forever.
Well, and it's interesting. It's always a thing that gets briefed about female politicians, and indeed it was briefed against Andrea Leadsom. Now, you got so cross in cabinet there were tears in your eyes, and actually...
No, they didn't even say tears in your eyes. They said she was weeping. And I'm just like, really? Was I? You know, prove it.
I almost made Andrea cry once. I had a bit of a cry in the chamber, yes.
All right, we've had a sort of common group non-weep. Laura, let's return to Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson, who may be making some people weep. But you've interviewed both of them at length.
Yes.
Your thoughts?
Well, strangely, they've got lots in common. And the biggest thing for the country to understand that they have in common is they've both put forward Brexit plans that aren't actually that different. And they've both put forward plans for Brexit that are full of ifs and buts. They're both dependent on trying to achieve something that they can't be sure they will. In a way, of course, that's politics, isn't it? But in this context, they're also both suggesting things that the EU has said no to on many occasions. People like Andrea Leadsom, and they would argue it's because they either weren't asked in the right way, or the politics weren't right, or the EU didn't want to listen. But that's the first thing to understand. They have that in common. And therefore, in terms of the choice for the Tory party on Brexit, yes, there is a bit of sort of, there's a back and forth about the deadline and when they would go to no deal. But fundamentally, there's not a kind of 180-degree difference between their Brexit plans. However, they are completely different characters, and they're approaching this in completely different ways.
Do you think it's going to change many minds over the next 4 weeks, the campaign?
I think that is not that likely. I think the dynamics of this campaign are pretty well set. Also, the ballots are going out to Conservative members really soon. And there's certainly a fear in the Jeremy Hunt campaign that actually, when they arrive on people's doormats, Tory members around the country, they'll fill them in the next kind of 10 days or so, and then it's basically done. That said, as I think I said last week, before the extraordinary story about the row at Boris Johnson and Carrie Symonds' home, never underestimate the capacity for Boris Johnson to implode. And that is, I think we've had 4 or 5 days of implosion, and we can't say never say never. Right. Sorry, we should say never say never.
Yeah. Do you worry about that? Do you worry about him tripping himself up rather than Jeremy Hunt?
No, I mean, as I set out at the beginning, the difference between Boris and Jeremy is Boris passionately believes in the bright future outside the EU, and he is totally determined to deliver it. But that's
not my question. Do you worry about him tripping himself up?
No, I don't, because I think people can see that about him in answer to your question. I think whatever happens, whatever the sort of buzz is in the background, people can see in Boris someone who is totally determined to deliver Brexit, and that's what they want to see. And, by the way, in the event that we did end up in a general election, if Parliament did decide to bring the government down, Boris would win an election precisely because he does appeal to people right around the country. He is somebody that people can relate to in a funny kind of way. He has the kind of normal life. He's a normal human being. You can relate to him. He's a good listener.
And you've wargamed that. And you've wargamed that, have you, the general election?
I don't think I've heard anyone ever say Boris Johnson has a normal life, but I think he has an imperfect character.
That's what I mean.
Yeah, and I think sometimes
life,
that appeals to people. He is, though, a very divisive politician. The point, though, about Boris Johnson, I think, which puts him in a category, a pretty small category of politicians, frankly, is he cannot be ignored. And people always have a view about him, whether it is positive or whether it is negative. People have a view. And there therefore is something compelling about that has cut through with the public. And there just aren't very many politicians who are in that category. There just aren't, even people with single name recognition. Yeah. And when it happens...
And around the world, too, not just at
the UK, not always for good reason.
And reputational reason.
And he's very divisive. But I think the one thing he does believe in, and what we are going to see over the next few weeks, we've seen it already, is him saying things, particularly on Brexit, that appear to be completely contradictory. There is no denying the fact that if you had to write a list of the things that he's saying about Brexit, some of them would cut across each other.
Can I just ask on that? Because when it comes to resolve to leaving on October the 31st, Theresa May was resolute about leaving on March the 29th. We heard it hundreds and hundreds of times. So why is his resolve any stronger than hers?
So this goes back to the point I've been making, which is that Boris truly believes in Brexit. And the problem...
But she believed in leaving on the 29th of March.
But you see, it's very different. If you campaign for Remain, if you feel, oh, no, we're much better to stay in, but, however, I will tolerate the decision and get on with it.
And that's how you think Theresa May viewed it?
In the end, at the time I didn't, clearly, because I withdrew so that she would become the Prime Minister.
Let's go across, because she is the Prime Minister, and we're going over to PMQs.
I'm sure that the whole House will want to join me in wishing the England football team the very best for their game against Norway tomorrow. Mr. Speaker, this morning my office hosted a reception to mark Armed Forces Reserves Day, and this coming Saturday we celebrate Armed Forces Day. This is an opportunity for us all to pay tribute to our servicemen and women here and around the world, for their dedication and service, and to those who have served in previous generations. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. Later today, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, and I will travel to Japan for the G20 Leaders Summit. With the threat of climate change putting future generations at risk, vile terrorist propaganda continuing to spread online, and rising tensions in the Gulf, this summit is an opportunity to address global challenges affecting all our nations.
As the thousands of people demonstrating outside will tell you, tackling climate change and biodiversity makes the world safer, more beautiful and sustainable for our children and grandchildren. Does the Prime Minister agree that one of the first acts of the next Prime Minister should be, urgently, a new Environment and Climate Change Bill, putting into place all the recommendations of the Committee on Climate Change to meet net carbon zero, making the world a more beautiful place?
Can I say to the honourable lady that we are introducing an environment bill as a government. We've introduced a 25-year environment plan. I think for the first time that any government has done that. We've committed to net zero emissions by 2050. That has gone through this House. But the question she needs to think about is why is the Labour Party in the House of Lords trying to block the net zero and 2050 legislation?
Julian Sturdy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the biggest restraints on what is a very positive economy in York and North Yorkshire is the lack of progress on devolution. Following the rejection of the One Yorkshire proposal, does the Prime Minister agree with me that we need to have a more local approach, such as a York and North Yorkshire deal, to rival those of the big urban centres?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, I absolutely recognise, as we do across government, the enthusiasm and dedication in Yorkshire for devolution and the potential seen there for harnessing local people's sense of identity with Yorkshire. And we share the ambition of doing what is best for Yorkshire, its people and its businesses. My right honourable friend, the Communities Secretary, has now met with Yorkshire leaders. Discussions are continuing about a different localist approach to devolution, and officials are having initial meetings with councils, including York, and will be interested in hearing their ambitions for devolution.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope the whole House will welcome today's mass climate lobby that's coming to Parliament today. And we should be proud of it. This House, after all, became the first Parliament in the world to declare a climate emergency. Yeah. And I want to pay tribute to the young people and young climate strikers that have done so much to raise awareness of this issue. And I hope members will take the chance today to meet those that are coming to lobby and learn from them, because they feel very passionately on the issue. I also acknowledge it's Armed Forces Day and the celebrations are going on this week, and I think we should be concerned about the welfare of both serving and former serving members of our armed forces. And I join the Prime Minister in congratulating the Lionesses for reaching the quarter-finals of the Women's World Cup and wish them well tomorrow night against Norway. Mr. Speaker, I welcome the judgment of the Court of Appeal last Thursday against UK arms sales to Saudi Arabia. The court found that the government had, and I quote, made no concluded assessments of whether the Saudi-led coalition had committed violations of international humanitarian law during the Yemen conflict and made no attempt to do so. Does the Prime Minister dispute that finding?
Here we go. We continue to operate one of the most robust arms export control regimes in the world. And we take our responsibilities on arms export licensing very seriously. Indeed, in the words of the 2017 judgment, the government engaged in anxious scrutiny, indeed at what seems like anguished scrutiny at some stages. We're disappointed that the court found against the government on one ground, and we will be seeking permission to appeal this judgment.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Mr. Speaker, Germany, as an EU member state, has banned arms exports to Saudi Arabia. So has Denmark, and both the US Senate and House of Representatives have voted to ban arms exports as well. The UN describes the situation in Yemen as, and I quote, humanity's biggest preventable disaster, and the government sees fit to continue selling arms to Saudi Arabia during that situation. So can I ask the Prime Minister a very simple question? Does she believe there are serious ongoing violations of international humanitarian law by Saudi Arabia in Yemen? Yes or no?
The right honourable gentleman knows very well that we consider these issues very carefully when we are dealing with these arms export licences, as has just been quoted by the court. But he references the situation in Yemen. This cannot go on. We need a political settlement in Yemen. I would remind the right honourable gentleman that the Saudi-led intervention was at the request of the legitimate president of the Yemen, following a rebel insurgency which overthrew the internationally recognised government, and the intervention has been acknowledged by the United Nations. Now, my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, held a Yemen Quad meeting on Saturday, expressing concerns at escalating tensions. But what do we see the Labour Party do? One of his MPs was inviting rebel leaders of the insurgency into the House of Commons. Yet again, Labour on the wrong side of the argument.
Jeremy Corbyn! The Prime Minister doesn't appear to understand the depth of feeling at the UN, parliaments around the world, and even the US Senate and House on this situation. The UN itself has warned that by the end of 2019, if the war continues, 230,000 people would have lost their lives, 140,000 of which are children under the age of 5. The UK and EU law states that the government must, and I quote, not grant a licence if there is a clear risk that the items used might be used in the commission of a serious violation of international humanitarian law. The government said they'd used the following criteria to judge that, and I quote, an understanding of Saudi military procedures, continuing engagement with the Saudis at the highest level, and Saudi public commitments to international humanitarian law. So if the Saudi government says they're respecting human rights, do we then ignore all evidence on the ground in Yemen and continue to sell weapons to this regime, which has led to this appalling death toll already in this conflict?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, first of all, as I've made clear, we're seeking permission to appeal the recent judgment. But the judgment isn't about whether the government made the right or wrong decisions, but about the decision-making process and whether it was rational. So we are considering the implications of the judgment alongside the permission to appeal that we're seeking. And while we do this, we won't grant any new licences for exports to Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners, which might be used in the conflict in Yemen. But he talks about the conflict in Yemen. As I've just said, let's remember what happened, why we are seeing this conflict in Yemen. It was the overthrow of the internationally recognised government by rebel insurgents. We are all concerned. We are all concerned. We are all concerned about the humanitarian situation in Yemen. That is, the Shadow Foreign Secretary might like actually, as this is an area of concern to her, remit, to actually listen to what the government is doing.
Order. The questions must be heard and the answers must be heard. The Prime Minister.
We are all concerned about the humanitarian situation in the Yemen. That is why, since the start of the conflict in 2015, our total commitment to Yemen, it now stands at £770 million. We are one of the major contributors to support for the humanitarian effort. Ultimately, the only way to resolve this issue is through a political settlement, and that is why we are supporting the efforts of the UN Special Envoy Martin Griffiths.
Corbyn! If that's the case, why is the government appealing the judgment instead of promoting a peace settlement in Yemen? Since 2016, Mr. Speaker, for 3 years, United Nations experts have been saying that the Saudi coalition has violated international humanitarian law in Yemen. This air campaign has killed tens of thousands and injured and displaced many more. The government says there can be no military solution to this particular conflict. There can only be a negotiated and political solution. If that is the case, why have they pumped £4.6 billion of military equipment into this brutal bombardment already?
I say to the right honourable gentleman, What we do believe, as I've just said, I've said in answer to his last question, I said it, I think, in answer to the first question that he gave me, that the only way to ensure the security and stability of Yemen for the future is through a political settlement. That is why this government is supporting the work that is being done by the UN Special Envoy Martin Griffiths. That is why we are continuing to use our diplomatic efforts, including, as I said, the Foreign Secretary holding a Yemen Quad on Saturday, to encourage others around the table. We are very clear. We support the efforts to secure the agreement by the parties to the conflict to implement the Stockholm agreements. That is an important part of the process leading to peace and a political solution. We need to ensure that work is essential so that progress can be made at the next round of peace talks and so that humanitarian supply lines can be opened up.
Jeremy Corbyn. It was her Trade Secretary who said there couldn't be a military solution to this conflict. Surely the government should think on this and stop the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia. Just last week, the UN Special Rapporteur, Agnes Kalamard, said there is credible evidence that the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and other high-level officials are personally responsible for the horrific murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Does the Prime Minister accept that assessment?
I say, right honourable gentleman, we do want to see accountability for this horrific murder. I raised the death of Jamal Khashoggi with King Salman at the Sharm summit. That's the second time I've done so. I've raised it with the Crown Prince at the G20 last year. I've stressed the importance of those responsible being held to account, of due process being followed. We expect Saudi Arabia to take the action necessary to ensure such violations of international and national laws can't happen again. The right direction, the right way to take this is through a judicial process, and we're obviously closely following the continuing investigation. We expect it to proceed in line with internationally recognised legal standards.
Jeremy Corbyn. Mr. Speaker, there is overwhelming evidence that war crimes have been committed in Yemen by Saudi Arabian forces. A state that flouts every human rights norm at home and abroad. Its government believes that it can kill with impunity journalists or civil rights campaigners, Yemenis or Bahrainis. It funds extremism around the world. But the UK has supplied them with over £4.5 billion worth of deadly weapons. UK weapons which have been used in indiscriminate attacks on civilians in which over 200,000 people have been killed. And hundreds of thousands more stand on the brink of famine, of starvation and of death from wholly preventable diseases. Surely, Mr. Speaker, the Court of Appeal judgment should be a wake-up call to the Prime Minister and the government. So instead of appealing the judgment, why not accept the judgment and stop arms sales to Saudi Arabia now and bring about peace in the Yemen and save those lives?
The right honourable gentleman says to me, bring about peace in the Yemen. It's exactly what we are working with our international partners to do through the United Nations and through the Yemen Quad. But also the right honourable gentleman is talking about the relations that we have with Saudi Arabia. That is a relationship that has saved lives of British citizens in the past. But let's just look at some of the relationships that the right honourable gentleman supports. When people were killed in Salisbury, his sympathies were with Russia. When terrorists were killing our people, his sympathies were with the IRA. And in the recent tanker attacks in the Gulf, his sympathies were with Iran. He never backs Britain, and he should never be Prime Minister.
Mr. Bradley. I'm a firm believer that youth work is part of the answer to so many issues in our society and has a huge role to play in my Mansfield constituency, but currently we're at risk of losing vital youth work qualifications. The review of these qualifications was announced on April the 1st, but the funding has been delayed in the system. If it's not secured, we're in danger of seeing universities and colleges drop these qualifications from 2020. So will my right honourable friend ensure that this funding is signed off immediately so we can continue to train amazing youth workers?
Well, my honourable friend has raised an important issue and the importance of the proper training of these youth workers. We are absolutely committed to properly qualified and trained youth sector. Subject to a business case, we have committed to renewing funding for these qualifications and reviewing the youth work curriculum. I know DCMS are in very close contact with the National Youth Agency and aware of the timing issues and hope to make an announcement on this in the near future.
Ian Blackford. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister with our reservists? I am happy today to be supporting a badge on supporting Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, and I hope in the days that the Prime Minister has left in office she will do what she can to secure the release of Nazanin from jail in Iran. And I hope the Prime Minister will join many of us outside Parliament today in support of the climate justice activists. And I have to say to the Leader of the Opposition that it was the Scottish Government that was the first government in the UK to declare a climate emergency. And I hope that the UK responds to the leadership that Scotland is giving on this issue. Mr. Speaker, do or die, come what may. Those are the words of the Prime Minister's likely successor. The truth behind the Brexit chaos in the Tory party is encompassed in those words. The Tory dream is to drag us out of the European Union no matter what the cost. Prime Minister, before you exit office, will you pledge to never vote for a successor willing to impose a devastating no-deal Brexit on all of us?
Well, I have to remind the right honourable gentleman yet again that he is due to ask me questions about my responsibilities as Prime Minister. And I would remind him yet again that as Prime Minister, I voted 3 times in this House to ensure that we could take the UK out of the European Union with a deal that was good for the whole of the United Kingdom, and he voted effectively for no deal.
Ian Blackford. My goodness, it's no wonder she's leaving. That was no answer to a question. The Prime Minister is showing gross cowardice. On the one hand, the Tories are asking people to put their faith in the most incompetent Foreign Secretary in a century. A man who has made a career out of lying, who has spent his week avoiding the media, staging photos and playing to the extreme delusions of the Tory shires. On the other hand, we have the most incompetent Health Secretary in our history. A man who writes books on privatising our NHS. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives clearly don't like the truth. Someone so desperate for a chance as his 30-year Downing Street fantasy that he's...
I think the right honourable gentleman's concluded his inquiry. Well, if he... Order! If he hasn't, he needs to do so in a single sentence. Order! Mr. Cowan, I'm sure you're a well-intentioned fellow, but I require no counsel from you. One sentence. We've got a lot of questions to get through. A sentence. Well done. Mr. Blackford.
Mr. Speaker, in her last days in office, will she finally act in the best interest of these islands, not the Conservative Party, and admit that neither of the candidates for office should ever be elected Prime Minister?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, either of the candidates for this high office would do a darn sight better job than anybody sitting on any of those benches.
Seldom have I had such a welcome in this house, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the announcements that the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions made yesterday. Would my right honourable friend update the House about some of those plans and how she feels that they will enable more people living with disabilities and health conditions to play their full part in our society?
Well, can can I first of all thank my honourable friend for the work that she did as Minister for Disabled People, which sets a lot of the groundwork for the announcement we've been able to make on the disability strategy. There are many disabled people in our society who would love to actually be able to get into the workplace. One of the key issues underpinning that strategy is support for people to enable them to take their full role in society, to get into the workplace, to ensure they have access to the support that they need. I'm very proud of the fact that something like 950,000 more disabled people are now in the workplace, thanks to the actions of Conservatives in government. There is more for us to do. The disability strategy sets our path to do that and enable disabled people to play their full role in our society.
Caroline Flint.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Almost every infrastructure project across the UK requires British-made steel. The contracts for the next 5 years alone are worth £1 billion. But yesterday, UK Steel and Community Trade Union members were asking me if the Scunthorpe Steelworks will still be working in 5 days' time. Will the Prime Minister guarantee that a month from now, before she leaves office, the Scunthorpe Steelworks will still be open?
Well, can I say to the Right Honourable Lady, we are concerned about the situation in relation to the Scunthorpe Works in relation to British Steel. That's why my Right Honourable friend, the Business Secretary, is engaging actively with the official receiver. Obviously, the official receiver has a responsibility in relation to this matter, but we are doing all that we can as a government. And I was pleased to meet with, obviously, as she knows, a number of members of Parliament who have steel interests in their constituencies to talk about the real impact that the closure of the works would have on people. That's why we're working so actively to try to ensure that we can retain the employment in that area.
Suella Braverman.
Mr. Speaker, I'm due to give birth any day now. I'm hoping there won't be an emergency in the Commons. But can I just put on record my thanks to you, the former Leader of the House, this government and cross-party MPs who have delivered the proxy voting scheme, which will enable my constituents to be represented during my maternity leave. Mr. Speaker, 11-year-old Ruby Lloyd from Hook with Warsash Primary School is campaigning for a pedestrian crossing on Warsash Road to encourage more pupils to walk to school, thereby improving road safety and air quality. Hundreds of local residents support her campaign, her headmistress supports her campaign, and so do her councillors. Will my Right Honourable friend get behind Ruby's campaign for safer roads in Fairham?
Can I first of all say to my honourable friend that we wish her the very best for the upcoming birth. And can I also say that I have a certain satisfaction having played a little role in ensuring that she and her husband actually got married, as she acknowledges. Can I say on the issue that she has referred to of Ruby? First of all, it's very good to see young people caring passionately about their local area and campaigning for their local area. And it's vital, obviously, that children can go to school in a safe environment. Of course, this is an issue for the local authority, but I would just like to wish Ruby the very best for her campaign.
Nick Thomas-Symonds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Universal credit is causing great hardship in my constituency. It is driving up debt, it is increasing food bank use, it is making people who are out of work worse off and people who are in work worse off. In her final weeks in office, will she act to halt the rollout of this failed policy, or will she simply leave this injustice burning?
I just say to the honourable gentleman, what lay behind universal credit was changing our benefit system. The legacy system we inherited from the Labour Party was one where over 1 million people were left on benefits for nearly a decade. What universal credit does is helps people into work and ensures that when they are in work, they are able to earn more. 200,000 more people in work. 1 million disabled people getting more money as a result of universal credit. 700,000 people getting the benefits they are entitled to as a result of universal credit. This is a policy that is working.
Paul Masterton.
Speaker, I know we're coming up to one of your favourite times of the year with Wimbledon starting next week, and many members have already been enjoying hitting a few balls on the courts in New Palace Yard. So will my right honourable friend take this opportunity to wish all the British players the best of luck in the championships, and also welcome the announcement from the Lawn Tennis Association of £250 million for 96 new indoor tennis centres to open up the sport to 3 million more people across the UK.
Yeah. Well, can I thank my honourable friend for in a very timely fashion raising this issue. I certainly wish all the very best to all the British players who will be participating in Wimbledon. I'd like to congratulate Andy Murray for his win in the doubles at Queen's at the weekend. I understand that there is an exhibition of tennis taking place here in Parliament today with the Paddock School from Putney taking part in that, and it's very good to see young people having that experience and having that opportunity, and I welcome the LTA, the fact that the LTA is directing funding across the whole country to where it's needed most to grow the sport from the grassroots up.
Mr. Khalid Mahmood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A recent YouGov poll into Islamophobia within the Conservative Party shows an astounding level of racism. Almost 50% polled would not want to see a Muslim Prime Minister. Only 8% would be proud if there was one. 67% believe racist myths about Muslim communities, and yet 8 out of 10 don't think this is a problem. In light of this, and as one of her final acts of her premiership, will the Prime Minister finally agree to commission an external inquiry into Islamophobia within her increasingly nasty party?
I say to the honourable gentleman, we take any allegations of Islamophobia very seriously in the Conservative Party. Every allegation is properly investigated. We have seen my right honourable friend, the chairman of the Conservative Party, take swift action. We have seen people suspended from the party. We have seen people excluded from the party. And I would just say to the honourable gentleman that it is in direct contrast to the way in which the Labour Party deals with anti-Semitism. Indeed, it is easier to be kicked out of the Labour Party for voting Liberal Democrat than for being anti-Semitic.
Alistair Burt! Speaker, there is a risk that complex conflicts thousands of miles away can sometimes appear deceptively simple at Westminster. Does my right honourable friend share my surprise that the Leader of the Opposition did not mention the Human Rights Watch had said last week that it was a potential war crime of Houthi drones targeting civilian targets in Saudi Arabia? And the World Food Programme has recently suspended aid in Houthi-controlled areas because of its diversion, aid workers not being allowed into Houthi areas, and aid being diverted to enrich Houthi forces. Is it not the case that it's best to recognise the horrors of war on all sides and concentrate not on being one-sided, but getting fully behind the tireless efforts of Martin Griffiths to seek peace in Yemen and support those efforts and bring this conflict to an end?
Can I thank my right honourable friend with his experience in the Foreign Office? He has seen and knows the complexities of these issues, and he's absolutely right that it is important that we look at what is happening in the Yemen and we recognise the actions that the Houthis have been taking as well. That is why it is so important to bring both sides around the table to ensure that we can get that agreed peace settlement and find supporting Martin Griffiths, the UN Special Envoy, in his efforts to bring the parties around the table. And he references the humanitarian aid. I said earlier the extent of humanitarian aid we've given. One of the great problems we've had to address is the way in which it is not always possible to get that aid to the people who need it most. Not because of our inability, because of the insurgents, the way in which the Houthis are preventing that aid getting to the people who need it most.
Aaron Lee!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Brexit uncertainty is hitting manufacturing businesses in my Lincoln constituency, and local managing directors have told me that no deal would be absolutely catastrophic for them, for their exports to Europe, and it will put local jobs at risk. One firm has even put workers on short-time working already, temporarily. Does the Prime Minister accept that her government, and I include in this statement either of her likely successors, have made a catastrophic no-deal Brexit a more likely outcome?
I wanted to deliver Brexit with a deal. I brought a deal to this House, and the Honourable Lady and her colleagues voted 3 times against that deal.
Andrew Griffiths!
On Monday, 160 years of food production on the same site in Burton ended with the announcement of the closure of the Kerry food plant in my constituency, affecting 900 jobs in both Burton and in the constituency of my friend from South Derbyshire. The Prime Minister will obviously have great sympathy for all of those workers who are concerned about their future, concerned about paying their mortgage, the holidays they have booked, and their families. Will she commit to a cross-department task force to try and help ensure we not only get those 900 people back into work, but we find a new use for that plant in Burton?
Yes. Well, obviously, as my honourable friend says, I'm sure this is going to be a very worrying time for the employees of Kerry Foods and their families. I understand that ministers from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy are speaking to my honourable friend to discuss the situation, and they will work with DEFRA and with housing communities and local government to explore the various options. We'll also want to work closely with businesses and local partners to ensure those affected are well supported, and indeed to explore options for the future of the site. And our thoughts are with those who will obviously be very concerned at this time.
Jay Stevens.
Mr. Speaker, 7-year-old Talia Balade, who's the daughter of my constituent Gosia Simanovic, was abducted by her father and taken to Libya in 2012. The father returned here without Talia, and she remains in Libya with his mother. He was jailed but released on licence in 2017, and he's now absconded and is not reporting to the Home Office. All Gosia's legal avenues have been exhausted, and she is really desperate. Will the Prime Minister please use every channel available during her final weeks in office to secure Talia's return to her mother in the UK?
I say to the Honourable Lady, obviously she's outlined this case here in the House. I will ensure that this is a matter that is looked into properly by department concerned.
Andrew Mitchell.
Mr. Speaker, on the Yemen-Saudi catastrophe that is taking place, isn't it the case that Britain should move to a position of far greater neutrality, supporting a comprehensive ceasefire? And while Britain is absolutely right to condemn the Houthi attacks on Riyadh and Jeddah, should we not also condemn the night after night bombings by the Saudi aircraft, which are killing innocent civilians and radicalising tens of thousands of young Yemenis?
I say to my right honourable friend, we have called for a ceasefire. We've supported the efforts that have been made for a ceasefire. We've supported those efforts around Hodeidah, a very important port, obviously, for getting humanitarian relief in. But this is why it is so important that we continue to work with our international partners and with the UN Special Envoy to bring about that ceasefire, to enable the parties to come round the table, to get the political settlement, which is the only way to ensure the future security and stability of Yemen.
Kerry McCarthy.
On Friday, Mr. Speaker, a 14-year-old girl with autism and a learning disability was placed in a secure mental health unit 150 miles from home. Her mother's already had to stop work, and her parents are now trying to scrape together the money to find temporary accommodation there so they can be near their child. Does the Prime Minister not agree that we really need decent, trusted facilities in every community for distressed children so that families don't have to go through this?
Well, the Honourable Lady makes a very important point, and obviously the emphasis that we are putting in the National Health Service on dealing with mental health and on improving the support that is available to mental health is a part of this. We are looking, and I held a round table looking at the outcomes of the review that we've had on the Mental Health Act, where exactly these sorts of issues about the type of circumstances in which people were being provided for was raised. And this is something that the NHS is looking at very carefully, and we are ensuring that there is funding available for further facilities to be provided.
Mary Robinson.
We're going to leave Prime Minister's questions at this point. We will, of course, return or bring you any major developments that happen in the final few minutes. Laura, let's just go back to Jeremy Corbyn's questions. In fact, before that, I should welcome our new guest, Drew Hendry, SNP MP. Welcome. Laura, Jeremy Corbyn chose to go on an issue that is very close to his and many in the Labour Party's hearts, and that is what is going on in Yemen. And this follows a recent court ruling that British arms sales to Saudi Arabia may have been ruled unlawful, but they haven't actually been banned in terms of selling further arms sales in the future.
That's right, and there's been controversy around this for a long time. There's a terrible, brutal war going on in Yemen, and for a long time there's been controversy about how much business the UK has been doing with the Saudi government in terms of arms sales that are allowing that war to keep getting worse. So the argument from Jeremy Corbyn and some of his backers, and many people who've taken an interest in this, is surely the UK should follow the example of some other countries and clamp down on selling the Saudi Arabian government any more arms while that conflict is raging in the way that it has. The government's always said, look, it's much more complicated than that. It is a very tricky pattern in the Yemen, and that they are involved, which is absolutely the case, particularly in trying to bring forward a peaceful solution to this. There's a very senior diplomat who happens to be from Britain called Martin Griffiths, who's been doing a lot of work around the world in trying to help bring this to a close. But it is a huge issue here, and not just for Labour MPs either. It was interesting, there were questions on this from Alistair Burt, former Foreign Office Minister, who couldn't be more across the detail of a very complicated situation, but also from Andrew Mitchell, the former Cabinet Minister, who's one of the MPs who's been working cross-party to try to get the UK to toughen up sanctions on Saudi Arabia.
Right, but when we have the campaign against arms trade, Andrea, which argues that the Saudi-led coalition likely violated international humanitarian law with its ongoing bombardment in Yemen, why is the government appealing this court decision?
Well, the UK's export rules for arms exports, so arms sales to Saudi Arabia, are incredibly strong. They were put in place by Robin Cook under the Labour government back in, I think, 2000, and they've subsequently been strengthened. And so there are no export licences given for arms that could be used for humanitarian.
Except the court ruled that the UK government failed to assess the risk of misuse of those weapons properly. So despite what you say, they're clearly not strong enough.
Well, I think, you know, hearing Alistair Burt there, he has clearly set out, I mean, he was in the Foreign Office dealing with these issues for a very long time. He has been incredibly careful and thorough in looking at exactly what is happening there. But as the Prime Minister said, Saudi Arabia is an enormous ally of the United Kingdom. It has provided a huge amount of support that has saved the lives of British citizens and military, and it is vital that we do keep that relationship with them.
Let's turn to you, Drew, and talk about Ian Blackford, obviously raging about the prospect of either of the candidates becoming Prime Minister, but particularly for Boris Johnson. But actually, aren't you relishing the idea of Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, seeing as he helps make your argument for Scottish independence? No. A panel-based poll in the Sunday Times Scotland last weekend found support for independence would jump to 53% if Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, giving the Yes campaign a clear 6-point lead.
Indeed, and that same polling exercise showed support for independence in general up at 49% within the margin of error.
That would give you a clear lead.
This is increasing things, but let's just be clear, there is no good Tory Prime Minister for Scotland, and either of the two candidates that are up there at the moment would do harm. We know that we heard Jeremy Hunt the other day saying that he'd be willing to sacrifice businesses who rely on the EU, and that was something he said, and we've seen Boris Johnson's view on the way that we need to take these things forward in an equally abhorrent way. So there is no good Tory Prime Minister for Scotland. We've been ignored all the way through the Brexit process. People in Scotland are very alive to that. Since the 62% of the people voted Remain, we've seen all the way through the process, Scottish Government ignored, Scottish Parliament ignored, MPs ignored, and all the way down. So Scotland knows it's being ignored.
Right, but do you accept you'd have a much greater chance of winning another independence referendum?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we've got a much better chance of winning an independence referendum anyway. That's what I'm saying. Because of what people have seen, it's put things into sharp focus about the way that Westminster, and I've got to say in particular the Tories, just don't care about Scotland at all. And we've seen that all the way through this process.
Right, and that is part of the reason, or even the whole reason, for that lead in that poll. No. I know there's a health warning with polls, but even so, does that concern you that actually, with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, you risk the union?
Boris Johnson is hugely proud of the United Kingdom and will take steps to strengthen the UK. We have, on our benches, we have now a really good group of Conservative MPs from Scotland. And what Drew is saying is his version of events, they don't like it on the Scottish nationalist side of the House when the Scottish Conservatives point out just how much the United Kingdom does for Scotland, how better we are, stronger together.
Well, why is every poll and vote showing that the Scottish public disagree.
The Scottish nationalists go on and on and on about independence rather than focusing on improving school results, on improving welfare results, on making sure that broadband gets rolled out properly in Scotland.
These are two reserved issues that you've just brought up there, Andrea.
There is a
the
Scottish
UK government
nationalist
is
obsession with independence.
But Andrea, some of your colleagues who are Scottish Conservative MPs do say privately they are really worried about what happens if Boris Johnson becomes Prime Minister. They're worried about their seats. And that's not necessarily the same as them saying they don't want him to be the leader. But they are aware, and they say privately, they worry about what image he would project and the impact that would have on the Conservatives in Scotland, who only relatively recently have shown more signs of life.
Well, the group of Scottish Conservative colleagues are a fantastic bunch. Very
How many of them are backing
themselves.
Boris Johnson?
Several. I'm not precisely
Four,
sure.
I think, out of a total.
But even so, that does show a level of support for Boris. And I think that for all of my Scottish Conservative colleagues, what they want to see is a Prime Minister who is actually going to deliver on the referendum so that we can move on to that bright future that awaits the entire United Kingdom. Opportunities for the Scottish whisky sector, for Scottish farmers. You know, there will be huge opportunities.
We could do with paying the farmers
for fishing.
For a start.
Well,
from the European funding that didn't come through to Scotland, that should have done. And why is it, if that's the case, if the Tories are doing so well, why is it during the EU elections that the Tories actually got their lowest results since they started calling themselves the Scottish Conservatives back in the 1960s?
You know, I'm deeply concerned that we haven't left the EU yet, that we're 3 years on from the referendum. And there is no doubt that people voted with their feet. They were angry with both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party for the failure to deliver on the referendum. What we have to do is to put that right, and I think under Boris we will do that. And then, as I say, there will be huge opportunities for the entire United Kingdom. Boris is firmly committed to the Union. And
well, you say that, but actually he's on record as saying that the Barnett formula needed to be rethought, and that's the amount and the proportion of money that goes to be Scotland, so that more money, he says, would come back to London. His support for reducing the number of Scottish MPs, how's that going to win people around in Scotland?
Well, you know, I think where the Barnett formula is concerned, there are issues over the fact that when the Westminster government agrees a big new policy that's in the interests of the United Kingdom, that the Scottish government will take their element of it under the Barnett formula and use it for something completely different, that therefore doesn't benefit the Scottish people.
Well, so you want to see changes too, don't you?
Well, I certainly think that what the Scottish government should be doing, the Scottish nationalists should be doing, is acting in the interests of the people of Scotland rather than acting in the interests of their First Minister, who just wants independence at the expense of everything else.
Well, again, I think this just shows why the Tories are so out of touch in Scotland and why they're doing so badly, and why the SNP have won every single election recently. All the polling results shows that we're doing well. That, in fact, actually, if you look at the EU elections, a record percentage of the vote across Europe, and again underlining the mandate to look after Scotland's interests. Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain, and we're opposing Brexit because, contrary to what Andrea says, there is no good Brexit. Her own government's analysis shows that every single version of Brexit will harm the economy. In Scotland, a hard Brexit would be up to 100,000 jobs, £2,300 per
That's just not the case. And isn't it interesting how Drew focuses on that referendum, and yet the 2014 referendum on independence showed very clearly a significant majority of Scots want to remain part of the United Kingdom.
We would secure our place in the European Union. That was what the people of Scotland were told at the time during that vote. Andrea, that's why the Tories are so out of touch. They don't understand what's going on in Scotland, and they're not listening, ignoring Scotland all the way through this process.
Drew, if the SNP is doing so well, and actually there is such an appetite for independence, and you are starting to really make that case, why hasn't the party given a firm commitment to actually holding another referendum? I mean, you have again held out the possibility, dangling it in front of your supporters without a firm commitment.
There's a bill going through Parliament at the moment to set the referendum in process. Until these things are in place, you can't actually have a referendum until it's there. But in 2016, the Scottish Government won 46.5% of the vote, the biggest percentage vote share of any UK party since, I think, 1966, on a mandate of holding an independence referendum if there was a material change. And we've seen a material change in the UK over Brexit. In this particular situation.
And you're going to get a new Prime Minister very shortly. So wouldn't that be the point at which... Yeah, but that would be the point, won't it, to say when you're going to have an independence
Well,
referendum?
that may well be the point to say that. I don't make that call personally.
But would you like to hear it then?
Look, I'm an SNP person. I've been a believer in independence for many, many years. So, of course, I want to see the quickest possible route for us to be able to look after our own affairs and be an equal partner in the European Union. Of course, I want to.
And it's difficult for the Labour Party because Scottish Labour officially supports a second Brexit referendum or EU referendum. So it's difficult for Labour to argue against another independence referendum.
Scottish Labour are the only party that want to be securely within the UK and within the EU, because we know that that's what's best for jobs, it's what's best for people. But you know, this squabbling.
No, but hang on, how can they argue? But how can they argue against giving the SNP another independence referendum when they want to have another EU referendum?
I'm not arguing against, you know, the technicalities of having another referendum. People don't want another referendum in Scotland. When Nicola Sturgeon made her big announcement recently about, you know, we're going to start the path for another independence referendum, I was out knocking doors that weekend and people were, you know, just so fed up, and they're saying, you know, another vote, and we don't want that more constitutional chaos. Have we not got enough of that with Brexit going on? We just want stability, security, and we want politicians to focus on the issues that we care about. That's what people tell me.
But Danielle, hang on, you just said you're not against the technicalities of another independence referendum. Are you suggesting then that Labour would allow another referendum to take place in Scotland? Because, of course, one of the curiosities about this is it is within a Westminster government's gift to grant one or not. If Labour were in power, would they allow one?
Right now, people don't want one. So no.
That's not the...
It's, you know, when we... If people were banging down our doors demanding that they want another referendum, fine, but they're absolutely not, quite the opposite. So there's no appetite there. We see that, you know, there's polls, but there's no clear majority. That's not what people want.
That's not entirely the case, is it? Because the most recent polls in the Sunday Times are showing that people do have an appetite for independence. And in fact, polling something around 60% in Scotland showing that not only should the Scottish Government decide when we should have a referendum, but there should be a referendum in the future on Scottish independence. So it's not quite the same. We can all knock on selected doors.
Right, but it's not in the gift at the moment of the Scottish Government. Andrea, a recent YouGov poll of Conservative Party members showed 63% would rather see Scotland independent than abandon Brexit. So in other words, your membership's just not that bothered anymore about losing Scotland. They want Brexit, but they don't mind about losing Scotland, according to that poll. You haven't done enough, have you, to earn that unionist label?
Well, I certainly would say that all the candidates throughout the leadership campaign, you know, all 10 of those who put their names forward are very committed unionists. I don't know a single member. But
these are grassroots. These are grassroots members.
Yeah, but the important thing is that whoever is the next Prime Minister needs to demonstrate greater commitment to the United Kingdom, to the fact that we're stronger together.
How could anyone demonstrate greater commitment than Theresa May says she did all the way through those negotiations?
I think I absolutely think
Northern
has done. I
Ireland.
mean, Drew was suggesting that Scotland was ignored. It certainly wasn't. I mean, there have been so many levels of consultation with each of the devolved administrations, and that has been absolutely at the heart of everything we've done. I sat on the Cabinet subcommittee looking at day one readiness, i.e. no deal, and each of the ministers, the relevant ministers from Scotland, Northern Ireland, and, well, civil servant from Northern Ireland and Wales were brought into those meetings so that they would be absolutely at the heart of it. So I don't agree that they've been ignored, but one of the things I would like to see from the next leader is that Cabinet should meet regularly in each of the in each of the devolved nations in the capitals to demonstrate more of a commitment to the stronger
if it came to it, and we've
United
seen
Kingdom.
the polls demonstrate that actually there could be, and is at the moment, increasing support for a second independence referendum in the likelihood that Boris Johnson becomes the next Prime Minister, would you choose Brexit, do or die, over keeping Scotland in the Union?
So Scotland had a referendum in 2014. It was overwhelmingly in favour of remaining a part of the United Kingdom, and I am a believer in referenda. So we will abide by that decision, and we will abide by the 2016 referendum at the UK level.
Question though, Andrew, if it comes to it, would you, as a Conservative, choose leaving the European Union, which you believe so passionately in, or trying to keep Scotland in the UK.
But that's a nonsense. What I'm saying is that there will not be a second referendum on Scottish independence. We've just had one in 2014. It was a very clear result. There will also not be a second referendum on membership of the... No, I believe in the results of the referendum. I don't believe in just having referenda. I believe in doing what the people told us to do.
And do you believe in
all circumstances?
The premise for a referenda should be correct? In other words, people shouldn't be sold a bill of goods, as we were, for example, in 2014, when we were told the only way to retain our European EU membership was to vote no. And that was a key plank. That was absolutely, Andrea.
Full clarity on what remaining part
again, in the same way you said about Scotland not being ignored, what action was taken over the Scottish Government's Our Place in Europe document when it was put forward to the UK government after Brexit?
There were so many levels, the joint committees, the constant meetings, departmental level meetings to look at... I mean, I myself, when I was DEFRA Secretary, came to Scotland to meet to talk specifically about farming and fishing. How often do the Scottish
changes were made to immigration?
How often do the Scots MPs talk to the fishing sector in Scotland, who are delighted to be leaving the European Union, to be out of the common fisheries policy? There are huge opportunities for the whole United Kingdom from leaving the EU. It's the Scottish nationalists who are so determined to just subsume everything into their ambition for an independent Scotland.
All right, on that, Ian Blackford last week called Boris Johnson a racist. This week in the Chamber has called him a liar. Is that acceptable?
Well, I think if you can't tell the truth in what should be the Parliament of the United Kingdom, where can you tell the truth? These are facts. Well, we know that, you know, I'd like to see somebody defend the case that Boris hasn't made racist comments or that Boris hasn't told lies. These are facts.
Well, the Speaker reprimanded Ian Blackford last week for unparliamentary language. Should he have intervened on this occasion when he was called a serial liar?
Well, when there is unparliamentary language, it is for the Speaker to intervene. The behaviour in the Chamber is a matter for the Chair. He or she should always uphold the proper parliamentary language.
And should John Bercow have done so on this occasion?
I mean, in my view, yes, but it is a matter for the Chair.
Right. Let's listen to the former Labour leader and return to our discussion about the Union and the possibility of an independence referendum in the future. Here's Gordon Brown.
The Union is more at risk now and in greater danger than in 312 years of its history. It is under threat from a Scottish nationalism that has become more extreme and more determined to create completely separate institutions, a Scottish pound, to leave the UK customs union and the single market, and it's under threat from either the indifference or the antipathy of the Conservative Party, which has ceased being the Conservative and Unionist Party, as I've said, and is now the Conservative and Brexit Party.
Well, Gordon Brown making the case there for the Union, but where's Jeremy Corbyn on this? Why is it the former Labour leader who is making the strong case here for the Union?
Oh, Jeremy's been in Scotland plenty. I've hosted him in Midlothian and was really popular in Scotland. But Gordon has such a unique perspective because he, of course, led a fantastic campaign throughout the Scottish independence referendum, which really captured the passion and the minds of people. And his argument is absolutely correct because this discussion we've seen here today is very typical of what happens whenever we discuss Scotland, whether it's in the media, whether it's in Parliament. And it's so frustrating because it just quickly turns to squabbling and finger pointing. And that turns people off. And that's why people get really fed up with politics.
So why is Labour, if you're obviously supportive of a more conciliatory approach then, why is it in the most recent elections that you're going backwards in Scotland?
Not conciliatory approach, but just looking at the actual issues. Things.
But why have you gone backwards then in Scotland? The approach isn't working, whichever way you look at it.
Well, you know, I'm sitting here as an elected MP. That's progress. So when I'm out,
fifth in Scotland in the European elections. I mean, you know, that unimaginable a few years ago that the Labour Party, the party of Gordon Brown and so many other, you know, distinguished Scottish Labour politicians of recent history, it was unthinkable to imagine Labour would have been in fifth place. What is going on there?
Well, it was unthinkable what happened in 2015, but we're working on rebuilding trust. We're working on being out in communities like mine, Midlothian, a traditional Labour area that then, you know, we lost touch with, and that was really sad. But we're looking at why that happened and building back trust. And again, you know, I'm sitting here and have 6 fantastic Scottish Labour colleagues in Parliament. So, you know, we can see that we are building back that trust, and we're doing that by speaking to people, not knocking on selected doors, as Drew said, but by being really hard-working local MPs.
All right, Andrea, I'm going to return to a question that we put to you before Prime Minister's questions about a no-confidence motion. If it is called in September, which certainly Labour is thinking about once the new Prime Minister is in place, do you believe there are as many as a dozen Tory MPs who would vote against a new Conservative government to avoid no deal?
No, I don't believe there are.
You don't?
No.
What do you say about Tobias Ellwood and saying that there are a dozen MPs who would do that? Ken Clarke said he might be one of them, Dominic Grieve another.
I think my Conservative colleagues would all agree that the worst thing that could happen to our country, the United Kingdom, is a Corbyn government. I mean, that would really take us back to the 1970s.
But if a new government loses that confidence motion, there are 14 days to try and form a new government, you could be in general election territory.
That is the case, yes. So the no confidence motion would have to be put by the opposition, the main opposition, so the Labour Party would have to bring it forward. And obviously for it to pass, it would have to have support from both sides of the House. It couldn't pass with just opposition support. So that's lots of ifs already. And then thirdly, the government would have to be unable to, within 14 days, have a confidence motion in the government that we won, and then we'd be in general election
There's
territory.
plenty for us to talk about in the
That's
autumn,
it.
isn't there?
Well, that's your lot for today until... Oh, did I do Newsnight yesterday? I can't remember. Let's check. I don't think it did. Did I? Oh, I don't know. I can't remember. Maybe I'll do Newsnight later on. But anyway, I'll be back tomorrow for more Politics Live and Question Time. And if that debate thing's on, if I can find it, I'll stream the debate as well. If I can find it, if it's on. But it might be on BBC. I hope, maybe. BBC News, something like that. I hope it is. I fucking hate advertisements. Fucking crap. Anyway, thank you all. Have a good day. Or night. Now, I guess. Evening, whatever. Anyway, enjoy whatever you're doing. I'm off to play some Counter-Strike. Ta-da.